The morning Grace Dalton walked into Miller's General Store with her head held high. Every woman in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, turned away like she carried smallpox, and old Mrs. Henderson actually spat on the wooden floorboards near her worn boots. It was July of 1876, and the summer heat made the inside of the store feel like standing too close to a cookstove. But the coldness directed at Grace could have frozen the Missouri River solid. She had come to town for flour and coffee, nothing more, but the whispers followed her like flies on spoiled meat. Ruined, they called her. Damaged goods. A cautionary tale for daughters who might get ideas above their station. Grace kept her eyes forward, her spine straight as a fence post despite the trembling in her hands. She was 22 years old, and 6 months ago she had been engaged to Thomas Whitmore, the banker's son, with a future as certain as sunrise. Then Thomas had gotten her alone in his father's study during a church social, made promises about moving up the wedding date, and taken what he wanted before disappearing to San Francisco with his father's blessing and a generous allowance. The Whitmores had money and influence. Grace had neither. When her condition became obvious, Thomas's mother had spread the story far and wide, painting her son as the victim of a scheming farm girl's trap. Never mind that Grace had lost the baby 2 months later from the stress and heartbreak. Now she was invisible and notorious all at once. No decent man would have her. No respectable woman would speak to her. Even her own father had barely looked at her since the scandal, though her mother still set a plate for her at meals with tight-lipped determination. Grace gathered her supplies with hands that wanted to shake, counting out her precious coins at the counter while Mr. Miller's eyes slid past her like she was not quite real. She was turning to leave when the door swung open hard enough to rattle the glass, and every head in the store turned to see who would make such an entrance. The man who walked in was tall and broad-shouldered, with dust on his boots and the kind of presence that made people step back without thinking about it. He wore a cattleman's hat pushed back enough to show dark hair and eyes the color of whiskey in firelight. His jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble, and there was a hardness to him that spoke of long trails and longer nights. Grace recognized him vaguely as one of the drovers who worked the ranches south of town, someone who came through occasionally with cattle bound for the railhead. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Grace. Something flickered in his expression, quick as summer lightning, and then he was walking straight toward her with purpose in every step. "Grace Dalton," he said, and his voice carried through the suddenly silent store like a judge pronouncing verdict. Grace felt her stomach drop. She did not know this man, had never spoken to him, could not imagine what he wanted with her. Around them, the townspeople had gone still as rabbits sensing a hawk. "I am Grace Dalton," she said, lifting her chin despite the fear racing through her blood. Whatever humiliation was coming, she would face it standing tall. The cowboy stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and summer grass. His eyes were intent on her face, searching for something she could not name. Then, to her absolute shock, he took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Name's Ryder Hayes," he said. "I have a ranch about 15 miles south of here. 300 head of cattle, good water, decent house. I am not a rich man, Miss Dalton, but I am not poor either. I can provide for a wife." The words did not make sense at first. Grace stared at him, her mind trying to arrange them into something comprehensible while the blood rushed loud in her ears. "I do not understand," she managed. Ryder Hayes's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left hers. "I am asking you to marry me, today, this morning." "I have already spoken to Reverend Cole, and he has agreed to perform the ceremony at noon." Behind them, someone gasped. Grace heard Mrs. Henderson's shocked whisper clearly in the stunned silence. "He cannot be serious. That ruined girl." Ryder's head turned, and the look he gave Mrs. Henderson could have stripped paint. "I would be careful what you say about my intended bride, madam. I take offense easily, and I hold grudges long." Mrs. Henderson's mouth snapped shut like a bear trap. Grace felt dizzy. This could not be happening. Men did not propose to ruined women, especially not in public, especially not men they had never even spoken to before. "Mr. Hayes, you do not know me. You cannot possibly want to marry me." "I know enough," Ryder said, his attention back on her face. "I know you have been treated shamefully by people who should have protected you. I know you hold your head up when lesser women would have run away or worse. I know you deserve better than what this town has given you. But why?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Grace could feel tears threatening, and she blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not. Ryder's expression softened just slightly. "Because I need a wife, and you need a new start. Because I am tired of eating my own cooking and coming home to an empty house. Because I watched you walk into this store with more courage than half the men I have ridden with, and I figured that is the kind of woman I want standing beside me." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because no woman should be made to feel ashamed for another man's sins." Grace's hands tightened on her package of supplies. This was insane. This was impossible. This was also the only chance she was likely to ever get to escape the suffocating judgment of Sioux Falls. "You do not love me," she said, testing the reality of it. "No," Ryder agreed. "And you do not love me, but we can build something decent together if you are willing to try. I promise you this much, Grace Dalton. I will never raise my hand to you. I will never shame you. What is mine, I protect, and if you say yes, you will be mine in the eyes of God and law." Around them, the store had erupted into frantic whispers. Grace could see Mr. Miller watching with his mouth hanging open. She could feel the weight of every scandalized, fascinated stare. She thought about her father's disappointed silence, her mother's worn grief, the endless years stretching ahead with nothing in them but shame and isolation. She thought about this stranger's steady eyes and the word intended said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "Yes, I will marry you." Ryder Hayes's face did not exactly smile, but something eased in it, some tension releasing. "Good. That is good." He offered her his arm like she was a lady at a dance instead of a ruined woman in a hostile store. "We should go tell your parents. Then I figure we have a few hours to get you properly courted before we make this legal." Grace took his arm because she did not know what else to do, and because the solid warmth of it was the first kind touch she had felt in months. As they walked toward the door, she heard someone mutter something ugly, but Ryder did not pause or look back. He just kept moving forward like the rest of the world did not matter, and Grace found herself matching his stride. Outside, the July sun was merciless and bright. Ryder helped her into a wagon that had seen better days but was sturdy enough, then swung up beside her and took the reins. "Your parents still on the Dalton farm, 3 miles east?" "Yes." Grace sat very still, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, her entire life had turned on its head. "How did you know where they live?" asked around. Ryder clicked to the horses and they started moving down the rutted main street. "I have been thinking on this for about 2 weeks now. Just took me a while to work up my nerve." 2 weeks? Grace turned to stare at him. "You have been planning to propose to me for 2 weeks, more or less." He kept his eyes on the road. "I came into town for supplies back in mid-June. Heard some women talking about you in the mercantile. They were not kind. Then I saw you coming out of the church, and you had this look on your face like you were facing down a firing squad but refused to flinch. I thought, now there is a woman with steel in her spine. Grace did not know what to say to that. She watched the familiar buildings of Sioux Falls slide past, the blacksmith's forge, the hotel, the saloon where men were already drinking despite the early hour. You could have any woman you wanted. Why choose someone with a ruined reputation? Ryder was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins. My mother was in a situation similar to yours, he said finally. Different details, same basic story. Man made promises, then disappeared when she got pregnant. She married my stepfather when I was still in her belly, and he gave me his name and raised me like I was his own blood. He was a good man, best I ever knew. Died 5 years back in a riding accident. I am sorry, Grace said softly. Point is, Ryder continued, I know what it means when people call a woman ruined. I know it is usually not her fault, and I know how cruel folks can be about it. When I heard those women talking, it made me angry. Then I saw you, and I thought maybe I could do something about it. They were leaving town now, heading east along the wagon road that led to the scattered farms. The prairie stretched out on all sides, endless grass rippling in the hot wind. Grace had spent her whole life in this landscape, but suddenly it looked different, full of possibility instead of just familiar and confining. What if I am not who you think I am? She asked. What if I disappoint you? Ryder glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something like humor in his face. What if you do? People disappoint each other all the time. We will figure it out as we go. It was such a practical, unromantic answer that Grace felt something loosen in her chest. This was not a fairy tale. Ryder Hayes was not a knight in shining armor. He was just a man who needed a wife and saw an opportunity to do a decent thing at the same time. That was more honest than the pretty lies Thomas had told her. I lost the baby, she said abruptly, needing him to know the full truth. 2 months after Thomas left. There was so much blood, and I thought I was going to die. My mother got the doctor, but there was nothing he could do. By the time it was over, there was nothing left to save. Ryder's jaw tightened, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. I am sorry you went through that. No woman should have to bear that kind of pain. I wanted to die, Grace confessed, the words spilling out now that they had started. For weeks afterward, I wished I had died. It would have been easier than facing everyone, than seeing the pity and the judgment. My father could barely look at me. The women I had known my whole life started crossing the street to avoid me. Thomas's mother told everyone I had tried to trap her son into marriage, that I was loose and calculating. She was protecting her boy's reputation at your expense, Ryder said flatly. That is what people with money do. They make sure their mistakes do not cost them anything. You are not afraid I am what they say. Grace studied his profile, the strong lines of nose and jaw, the way he held himself like a man used to hard work and harder decisions. What if I am loose? What if I am a schemer? Ryder laughed, short and sharp. Lady, if you are a schemer, you are the worst one I have ever seen. A scheming woman would have made sure that banker's boy could not run off. She would have gotten a ring and a ceremony before she let him near her. You are not a schemer. You are just someone who trusted the wrong person. The simple declaration made Grace's throat tight. She blinked hard and looked away, watching the prairie blur past. You are a strange man, Ryder Hayes. I have been called worse. The Dalton farm came into view. A modest house with a barn and a few outbuildings, fields of wheat stretching behind. Grace's stomach knotted as Ryder turned the wagon up the drive. Her father would be in the fields at this hour, but her mother would be inside, probably doing the washing or starting dinner preparations. Ryder helped her down from the wagon, his hands firm and steadying on her waist. Grace noticed he did not let go immediately, and she found herself grateful for the solid presence of him as they walked toward the house. Her mother opened the door before they could knock, wiping her hands on her apron. Mary Dalton was a thin woman made thinner by worry, her dark hair streaked with gray despite being only 43. She looked at Grace, then at Ryder, and her expression filled with weary confusion. "Grace, what is going on? Who is this?" "Mrs. Dalton, my name is Ryder Hayes. I own the Hayes Ranch south of town. I've come to ask your permission to marry your daughter." Mary Dalton stared at him like he had started speaking Chinese. Grace felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat and swallowed it down. "You want to what?" Mary's eyes went to Grace, searching. "Grace, what is this about? He asked me to marry him, Mama, in the middle of Miller's store in front of everyone, and I said yes." Mary's face went pale, then flushed. "You cannot be serious. Grace, you do not know this man. This is madness." "With respect, madam," Ryder said, "your daughter's reputation in this town is destroyed through no fault of her own. She has no prospects, no future here. I am offering her both. I have a good ranch, steady income, and I can give her a decent life." "Why?" Mary's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Why would you want to marry her? What is wrong with you that you would take on a girl with her reputation?" Grace flinched, but Ryder's expression did not change. "There is nothing wrong with your daughter, Mrs. Dalton. The wrong was done to her, not by her. As for why I need a wife, I am 30 years old, and I am tired of living alone. Your daughter has courage and dignity, and those are qualities I value." "Courage and dignity do not make a marriage," Mary said, but her voice had lost some of its sharpness. Grace could see her mother's exhaustion, the weight of 6 months of shame and worry. "Love makes a marriage. Love can grow," Ryder said simply. "Respect is a good place to start." Mary looked at Grace, really looked at her, and something passed between them that did not need words. Grace realized with a pang that her mother understood exactly what this offer meant, understood that it was likely the only chance Grace would ever have at something resembling a normal life. "You will be kind to her?" Mary asked Ryder, and there was steel under the question. "You will treat her well, I give you my word." Mary was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Frank is in the north field. You should talk to him before you do anything else." Finding Grace's father took another 20 minutes. Frank Dalton was a weathered man of 46, stooped from years of hard labor, his face permanently etched with lines of disappointment. When Ryder explained his intentions, Frank listened in silence, his gaze moving from Ryder to Grace and back again. "You are sure about this?" he asked Ryder. "I am sure." Frank looked at Grace. "And you?" Grace met her father's eyes for the first time in months. "Yes, Papa, I am sure." Frank studied them both, then sighed heavily. "Then I suppose you have my blessing if that is what you are asking for. God knows she will not have any other offers." The word stung, but Grace was beyond being hurt by her father's inability to defend her. She simply nodded and said, "Thank you, Papa." They left Frank in the field and returned to the house, where Mary was already pulling out Grace's few good dresses and packing a small trunk. "You will need your things," she said briskly, not looking at either of them. "If you are doing this, you should have what is yours." Grace helped her mother pack in silence, folding the simple dresses and undergarments, the well-worn shoes and the shawl her grandmother had made. It did not take long. She did not have much. When the trunk was full, Mary sat down heavily in a kitchen chair and looked at Grace with tears in her eyes. "I wanted better for you. I wanted you to marry a man you loved, have a wedding with flowers and music, be happy." Grace knelt beside her mother's chair and took her work-roughened hands. "I know, Mama, but this is my chance at something better than what I have here. Mr. Hayes seems like a good man. That is more than I had yesterday." Mary pulled Grace into a fierce hug. "You write to me. You let me know how you are doing. And if he ever treats you badly, you come home. I do not care what anyone says. I will, Mama. I promise. Ryder loaded the trunk into the wagon while Grace changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that was clean and mended. When she came outside, he was talking quietly with her mother, and Mary was nodding at whatever he was saying. They both looked up when Grace approached. "Your mother has given me a list of things you will need for the house," Ryder said. "We will stop in town and get you properly outfitted before the ceremony." Grace felt her stomach flutter. The ceremony. She was getting married in a few hours. To a man she had met an hour ago. Mary walked them to the wagon, holding onto Grace's hand until the last possible moment. "Be happy," she whispered. "Please try to be happy." "I will try, Mama." The ride back to Sioux Falls was quieter than the ride out had been. Grace watched the prairie slide past and tried to imagine her new life. A ranch 15 miles south of town, cattle, a house she had never seen. A husband who was still essentially a stranger. "Are you scared?" Ryder asked after a while. Grace considered lying, then decided against it. "Terrified." He nodded like that was exactly what he had expected. "Me too, if it helps." It did help, actually. Grace looked at him with new curiosity. "What are you scared of?" "That I will not be what you need, that I will fail you somehow." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I am not good with words, Grace. I am better with animals than people. I spent most of my life on the trail driving cattle. I only bought the ranch 2 years ago, and I am still figuring out how to run it properly. I am rough around the edges, and I do not have fancy manners. You might find me hard to live with." "And you might find me hard to live with," Grace pointed out. "I am stubborn, and I have a temper when pushed too far. I can cook and clean and manage a house, but I do not know anything about ranching. I might make mistakes that cost you money or time." Ryder's mouth quirked into something almost like a smile. "Then we will make mistakes together and figure it out as we go." They reached Sioux Falls just before 11. Ryder drove straight to the Mercantile, and this time when they walked in together, the reaction was different. Word had clearly spread about the proposal, and people stared with open curiosity instead of contempt. Mrs. Henderson was still there, and she watched them with narrowed eyes, but she did not say anything. Ryder spent the next hour buying things for Grace with a practicality that was almost overwhelming. A new dress for the ceremony, this one a deep green that brought out the color in her eyes, fabric for making more dresses, boots that actually fit properly, a warm coat for winter, undergarments and nightgowns, and a dozen other necessities. He never once questioned the cost or made her feel like she was being extravagant, just asked her what she needed and bought it. When the pile was finally assembled, Mr. Miller tallied up the cost with wide eyes. "That will be $43.60, Mr. Hayes." Ryder paid in cash without blinking, then gathered up the packages. "We will pick these up after the ceremony. Can you have them ready to load?" "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." They walked to the church with 15 minutes to spare. The small white building sat at the edge of town, its steeple pointing toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Reverend Cole was waiting on the steps, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. "Mr. Hayes, Miss Dalton, are you both certain you wish to proceed?" "We are certain," Ryder said firmly. The Reverend nodded slowly. "Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly, but I have seen too many people wait for perfect circumstances that never come. Sometimes faith and commitment are enough to build on." They went inside, the church dim and cool after the brilliant sunlight. It smelled of beeswax and old wood and the lingering scent of Sunday flowers. Grace stood at the altar beside Ryder Hayes, a man she barely knew, and tried to steady her breathing. The ceremony was simple and quick. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Just Reverend Cole's steady voice reading the traditional words, asking if they would love and honor and cherish till death parted them. Grace said "I do" with a voice that shook only slightly. Ryder's "I do" was rock solid. The ring? Reverend Cole asked. Ryder reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It was not fancy or expensive, but it was real and solid as he slipped it onto Grace's finger. It fit perfectly. "I now pronounce you man and wife. Mr. Hayes, you may kiss your bride." Ryder turned to Grace, and she saw the question in his eyes. She nodded, just barely, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was brief and chaste, nothing like the demanding kisses Thomas had forced on her, but somehow it felt more intimate because Ryder was being careful with her, treating her like something precious. When he pulled back, Grace was breathless. "Congratulations," Reverend Cole said warmly. "May God bless your union." They signed the marriage certificate, Reverend Cole's wife and the church organist serving as witnesses. Grace stared at her new name written in the Reverend's neat handwriting. Grace Hayes. It looked strange and foreign and somehow right all at the same time. Outside, the noon sun turned everything to white gold. Ryder helped Grace into the wagon again, and they drove to the mercantile to collect their purchases. People watched them pass, and Grace saw the shock on their faces, the disbelief. She was married. She was respectable again. Or at least she had a husband who said she was respectable, which amounted to the same thing. They loaded the wagon with Grace's trunk and the packages from the store, and then Ryder was driving them out of town, heading south on the main road. Grace watched Sioux Falls disappear behind them and felt a complicated mixture of relief and loss. She had lived there her entire life. Now she was leaving, married to a stranger, heading toward a future she could not begin to imagine. "How far to your ranch?" she asked. "About 2 hours at this pace. We should get there mid-afternoon." Ryder glanced at her. "You can ask me anything you want to know. I figure we should get to know each other, seeing as we are married now." Grace thought about where to start. "How long have you had the ranch?" "Bought it 2 years ago from a widow who was moving back east to live with her daughter. It is not a big spread, but it is good land. I have a couple of hands who help with the cattle, Sam and Martinez. They are good men, trustworthy. They bunk in the old soddy about a quarter-mile from the main house." "What is the house like?" "3 rooms. Bedroom, main room with the kitchen, and a small room I have been using for storage. It needs work. I have not exactly been keeping it tidy living alone." He looked almost embarrassed. "I am not much of a housekeeper." Grace felt herself smile slightly. "I can manage that part. I have been keeping house since I was 12. Your mother said you are a good cook." "I am adequate. Nothing fancy, but I can make meals that will not poison you." Ryder laughed, the sound surprising and pleasant. "That is all I am asking for." They fell into conversation after that, trading basic information about themselves. Grace learned that Ryder had been born in Missouri, that his stepfather had taught him the cattle trade, that he had spent 10 years driving cattle from Texas to the railheads in Kansas and Nebraska, before saving enough to buy land of his own. He told her about his mother, who had died from influenza 3 years back, and how she had never stopped being grateful to the man who had given her and her son a home and a name. Grace told him about growing up on the farm, about her 2 younger brothers who had both gone west to try mining in Colorado, about learning to read from her mother and loving books even though they had so few. She told him about Thomas, the whole ugly story, because it seemed like something he should know. Ryder listened without interrupting, his face growing harder as she spoke, but he did not say anything except, "He was a coward and a fool." The prairie rolled past, grass and sky and the occasional distant farmstead. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Grace was grateful for the bonnet that shaded her face. Ryder pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a creek that ran year-round, a stand of cottonwoods that meant water close to the surface. "That is the boundary of my land," he said finally, gesturing to a fence line. "Everything from here south about 2 miles and east to west about 1.5 miles. Not huge, but big enough to run 300 head comfortably." They followed a track that was barely more than wagon ruts through the grass, and then the house came into view. It was a solid frame structure, built of lumber rather than sod, with a peaked roof and a covered porch along the front. It was not large, but it looked sturdy and well made. Behind it stood a barn and several corrals, and Grace could see cattle grazing in the distance. 2 men came out of the barn as the wagon approached, both covered in dust and clearly in the middle of working. One was an older man with gray in his beard and a weathered face. The other was younger, dark-skinned with black hair and eyes that took in the scene with quick intelligence. Ryder pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. "Sam Martinez, I want you to meet my wife, Grace Hayes. We were married this morning." Both men stared, their expressions identical masks of shock. Then the older one, Sam, broke into a slow grin. "Well, I will be damned. You actually went and did it. Congratulations, boss." Martinez tipped his hat to Grace. "Senora Hayes, welcome." Grace nodded to both of them, acutely aware that she was being evaluated. "Thank you." Ryder jumped down from the wagon and came around to help Grace down, his hands steady on her waist again. "Sam Martinez, can you help me unload this? Then I figure we will give you boys the rest of the day off. You can head into town if you want or just take it easy." The 2 ranch hands exchanged glances that spoke volumes, but they both just nodded and started helping with the packages and trunk. Grace stood on the porch and watched, feeling out of place and overwhelmed. This was her home now. These people were her responsibility in a way. She was a wife, a rancher's wife, and she had no idea what she was doing. Ryder carried her trunk into the house, and Grace followed him inside. The main room was exactly as he had described it. A kitchen area on one side with a cast iron stove and a few rough cabinets. A living area on the other with a table, chairs, and a sagging settee. It was clean enough, but basic, the kind of space where a single man lived without thought to comfort or decoration. The bedroom was just large enough for a bed, a bureau, and a small washstand. The bed was neatly made, which surprised Grace until she realized Ryder had probably made it that morning before heading to town. "I know it is not much," Ryder said, watching her take it in. "But we can make improvements. If there are things you need, just tell me." Grace turned to look at him, this man who was now her husband. He looked uncertain, almost vulnerable, and she realized he wanted her approval, wanted her to think his home was good enough. "It is fine," she said honestly. "It is more than I expected, really. I thought I would be stuck in my parents' house forever, watching my life waste away. This is a new start, Ryder. That is worth more than fancy furniture." Something in his face relaxed. "I am glad you think so." They heard the wagon pulling away as Sam and Martinez headed off, leaving them alone for the first time as husband and wife. The silence stretched out, suddenly awkward. "Are you hungry?" Grace asked, needing something to do. "I could make some dinner." "That would be good." "I have supplies in the pantry, nothing fancy." Grace found the pantry, a small closet off the kitchen area, and began pulling out ingredients. Salt pork, potatoes, onions, flour. She could make something serviceable out of that. She built up the fire in the stove, found a skillet and a pot, and set to work with the ease of long practice. Ryder watched her for a moment, then said, "I am going to tend to the horses and check on the stock. I will be back in an hour or so." "All right." He left, and Grace was alone in the house that was now hers. She moved through the kitchen, finding where things were kept, mentally cataloging what she had to work with. It was soothing having a task to focus on, something concrete to do with her hands. She fried the salt pork until it was crispy, cooked the potatoes and onions in the drippings, mixed up biscuits and slid them into the oven. By the time Ryder came back, dusty and tired, the table was set and dinner was ready. He washed up at the pump outside, then came in and sat down with visible appreciation. "It smells amazing." "It is just simple food," Grace said, but she was pleased. They ate in silence at first, both hungry and focused on the meal. Then Ryder said, "This is the best thing I have eaten in months." Possibly years. Grace felt herself smile. "You must have been living on some terrible food then." "Burned bacon and hard tack mostly. Sam can cook if he has to, but neither of us enjoyed it much." "Well, you will not starve now anyway." After dinner, Grace cleared the dishes and heated water for washing them. Ryder helped, drying as she washed, and the domestic simplicity of it felt strange and right all at once. They were married people doing married things, establishing rhythms and patterns that would define their life together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Grace felt her nervousness return. They were married. There were expectations that came with that, even in a marriage as unconventional as theirs. She thought about Thomas, about pain and shame and being used, and her hands started to shake. Ryder must have noticed because he said quietly, "Grace, I am not going to push you into anything you are not ready for. We are legally married, but that does not mean I expect you to welcome me into your bed tonight or any night until you are comfortable with the idea." Grace turned to look at him, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation. She saw only sincerity. Most men would not feel that way. "I am not most men, and you have been through enough. I am not going to add to it." The knot in Grace's chest loosened slightly. "Thank you. I can sleep on the settee. It is not comfortable, but I have slept in worse places." "The bed is big enough for 2 people," Grace said slowly. "If you are willing to stay on your side of it, I think I could manage sharing." Ryder nodded. "I can do that." As full dark fell, they prepared for bed with an awkwardness that was almost comical. Grace changed into one of her new nightgowns in the bedroom, while Ryder was outside doing a final check on the animals. When he came back in, she was already under the covers, her heart pounding. He changed in the main room, then came into the bedroom wearing just his union suit and climbed carefully into bed on the far side. They lay there in the darkness, both rigid and careful not to accidentally touch. "Good night, Grace," Ryder said after a while. "Good night, Ryder." Grace stared at the ceiling and marveled at the strangeness of her life. This morning she had been a ruined woman with no prospects. Now she was a married woman lying in bed next to a husband who had promised to be patient with her. It was not love, not romance, but it was kindness, and that was something she had almost forgotten existed. She fell asleep listening to Ryder's steady breathing and feeling, for the first time in months, like maybe things would be all right. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and learning. Grace threw herself into making the house a home, scrubbing and organizing and cooking meals that made Ryder and the ranch hands groan with appreciation. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, when the men would be out working and when they would come in hungry and tired. She started a kitchen garden, planting late-season vegetables that would give them fresh food before winter came. Ryder was gentle with her, patient in ways she had not expected. He never pushed, never demanded, just treated her with a steady respect that slowly began to ease the wounds Thomas had left. They talked in the evenings after dinner, sharing stories and opinions, learning each other's minds. Grace discovered that Ryder was smarter than his rough exterior suggested, that he had opinions on politics and books and the state of the world. He discovered that Grace had a sharp wit and could make him laugh with her observations about people and life. Sam and Martinez accepted her presence with cheerful ease. Sam turned out to be a fountain of ranch wisdom, teaching Grace about cattle and horses and how to read the weather. Martinez was quieter but kind, and he showed her how to handle a rifle so she would not be helpless if trouble came while the men were out working. Slowly, carefully, Grace began to feel safe. One evening about a month after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Ryder said, "I am going to have to drive some cattle to market next week. It will take about 4 days, maybe 5. Sam and Martinez will come with me. Will you be all right here alone?" Grace felt a flicker of fear but pushed it down. "I will manage. You need to sell cattle. That is how you make a living. I do not like leaving you alone, but we have had a good season and the prices are high right now. It makes sense to sell while we can. Then you should go." "I am not helpless, Ryder. I know how to handle a gun and I can take care of myself for a few days." He looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You are tougher than you look, Grace Hayes. I have had to be." The night before Ryder left, Grace lay in bed staring at the darkness and feeling something shifting inside her. Over the past weeks, Ryder had become more than just the stranger who had rescued her from public shame. He had become a friend, someone she looked forward to seeing each day, whose presence made her feel settled and content. She trusted him in a way she had not trusted anyone since before Thomas. More than that, she was starting to care about him in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. She rolled over to look at him in the faint moonlight coming through the window. He was asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, one arm thrown over his head. He was a handsome man, she realized with a little jolt. She had been so focused on survival and adjustment that she had not really looked at him. But now, she let herself appreciate the strong lines of his face, the breadth of his shoulders, the capable hands that had never once been raised to her in anger. She wondered what it would be like to close the distance between them, to reach out and touch him, to invite him to be a true husband instead of just a patient roommate. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. Ryder and the hands left at dawn, driving 30 head of cattle toward the railhead at Yankton. Grace stood on the porch and watched them go, feeling more alone than she had since the wedding. The house was silent without Ryder's presence, and the prairie seemed to stretch out endlessly in all directions. She spent the first day cleaning, keeping busy to avoid thinking about how isolated she was. The second day she worked in the garden and baked bread. By the third day she was restless and anxious, jumping at every sound, watching the horizon for Ryder's return. On the fourth day, a rider appeared in the distance. Grace's heart leapt, thinking it was Ryder returning early. Then she realized it was only one horse, not a group of riders, and the sick feeling of fear returned. She went inside and got the rifle Martinez had taught her to use, then stood on the porch with it held ready but not raised. The rider came closer, and Grace's stomach dropped when she recognized the horse. It was a fine bay gelding, the kind of animal that cost real money. The kind of animal a banker's son would ride. Thomas Whitmore pulled up in front of the house, sitting easy in his saddle like he owned the world. He was just as handsome as Grace remembered, with golden hair and blue eyes and features that belonged in a painting. Looking at him now, she felt nothing but cold disgust. "Grace," he said, smiling like they were old friends. "Or should I say Mrs. Hayes? I heard about your unexpected marriage." "Congratulations." Grace kept the rifle pointed at the ground but her finger near the trigger. "What do you want, Thomas? Just to talk. Is your husband home? That is none of your business." Thomas's smile widened. So he is not. That is convenient. May I come in? I have had a long ride. No. Say whatever you came to say and then leave. He sighed, the picture of wounded patience. Grace, there is no need to be hostile. I just wanted to see how you are doing. Make sure you are all right. You wanted to make sure I am all right. Grace's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Where was that concern 6 months ago when you left me pregnant and ruined? Where was it when your mother was spreading lies about me all over town? Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. I know I handled things badly. I was young and scared. My father said I had to think about my future, about the family name. But I have thought about you, Grace. I have worried about you. How kind, Grace said flatly. When I heard you had married some rough cowboy, I was concerned. You deserve better than this. He gestured at the modest house and outbuildings. You could have had everything if you had just been patient. I am back from San Francisco now, and my father is talking about me taking over the bank eventually. We could still have a good life together. Grace stared at him, genuinely shocked. Are you insane? You think I would leave my husband for you after what you did? Be reasonable, Grace. This Hayes fellow is just a rancher. He probably married you because he needed a cook and someone to warm his bed. With me, you could have status, money, a real future. The rifle came up before Grace even thought about it, pointing straight at Thomas's chest. Get off my property, now. Thomas's eyes widened, but he held up his hands placatingly. Grace, come on, you are overreacting. I am about to shoot you if you do not leave. That would not be overreacting. That would be self-defense. Now get out of here before I decide your horse would be better off without its rider. For the first time, real fear flickered across Thomas's face. He backed his horse up several steps. You have changed. Yes, Grace said, I have. I am not a naive girl who believes pretty lies anymore. I am a woman with a loaded rifle and a very short temper where you are concerned. Leave. Thomas yanked his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing back the way he had come. Grace stood on the porch shaking, the rifle still raised, until he was completely out of sight. Then her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the porch steps. She was still sitting there an hour later when Ryder came riding up with Sam and Martinez trailing behind him. He was off his horse in an instant, crouching in front of her with concern written all over his face. Grace, what happened? Are you hurt? Grace looked at him, at his worried eyes and the dusty trail clothes, and the way his hands hovered near her like he wanted to touch her but was not sure if he should. Something cracked open inside her chest. Thomas came here, she said. Thomas Whitmore. He wanted to convince me to leave you and go back to him. Ryder's face went dangerous. He what? I pointed the rifle at him and told him to leave. He did. Grace found herself starting to laugh, high and slightly hysterical. I threatened to shoot him, Ryder. I actually pointed a gun at him and meant it. Good, Ryder said fiercely. He is lucky you did not pull the trigger. If I had been here, I might have done it myself. He paused. Are you really all right? He did not hurt you. No, he just talked. But Ryder, he thought I would leave you. He actually thought I would want to go back to him after everything. Grace looked up at her husband, this good man who had given her back her life. He called you just some rough cowboy like you were nothing, but you are worth 100 of him. You are worth 1,000. Something shifted in Ryder's expression. Very slowly, he reached out and cupped her face in his rough hands. Grace, I need to tell you something. I married you because I thought it was the right thing to do, because you deserved better than what you were getting. But somewhere in the last month, that changed. I am falling in love with you. I think I might already be in love with you. And if that Whitmore boy ever comes near you again, I will not be responsible for what I do to him. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, clean tears. I think I am falling in love with you too. I did not expect it, but you have been so good to me, so patient. You make me feel safe in a way I never have before." "Can I kiss you?" Ryder asked, his voice rough. "A real kiss, not like the one at the wedding." "Yes," Grace whispered. "Please." He kissed her there on the porch steps with Sam and Martinez pretending very hard not to notice, and it was nothing like being kissed by Thomas. Ryder's kiss was gentle but passionate, asking rather than demanding, and Grace found herself kissing him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace saw the same wonder in his face that she felt. "Wow," she said softly. "Yeah," Ryder agreed, his voice hoarse. "Wow." That night, Grace invited Ryder to truly be her husband, and he accepted with a tenderness that made her cry. He was careful with her, patient, making sure she was comfortable and willing every step of the way. It was nothing like her experience with Thomas. This was what it was supposed to be like, she realized. This was what making love meant when both people cared about each other. Afterward, she lay in Ryder's arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. No regrets. He asked quietly. "None," Grace said honestly. "You, not a single one. Best decision I ever made, walking into that store and asking you to marry me. Best decision I ever made was saying yes." The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. She fell completely in love with her rough cowboy husband, and he with her. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with equal dedication. The house became a home, filled with small touches that made it uniquely theirs. Grace hung curtains and made cushions for the chairs. Ryder built her a bigger kitchen table and shelves for books. They talked and laughed and made love with increasing confidence and joy. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with brutal cold and heavy snow. Ryder and the hands worked long hours keeping the cattle fed and the water from freezing solid. Grace kept the house warm and the food plentiful, waiting for those evenings when Ryder would come in half frozen, and she could help him thaw out by the stove. It was during one of those storms in January of 1877 that Grace realized she had missed her monthly bleeding. She waited another month to be sure, fear and hope warring in her chest. When she still did not bleed, she told Ryder one night after dinner, her hands shaking, "I think I am pregnant." Ryder went completely still. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. I am about 2 months along, I think." He was silent for so long that Grace felt panic rising. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, needing to hear it. "Happy, Grace. I am terrified and thrilled and absolutely over the moon. A baby, our baby." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You are going to be such a good mother." "I am scared," Grace admitted. "After what happened last time, I am so scared something will go wrong." "I know, but we will get through it together. I will take care of you, Grace. I promise. Nothing bad is going to happen." He could not really promise that, of course. But Grace took comfort in his certainty anyway, in the strength of his arms around her and the love in his voice. As her belly grew, Ryder became almost comically protective. He would not let her lift anything heavy or work too hard. He fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate enough and rested enough. Sam and Martinez treated her like fragile glass, which would have been annoying except it was so clearly coming from a place of care. Grace's mother came to visit in the spring, brought by Ryder, who had driven to Sioux Falls specifically to fetch her. Mary Dalton cried when she saw Grace, round-bellied and glowing with health and happiness. "You look wonderful," Mary said, hugging her daughter carefully. "Marriage agrees with you." "It does," Grace agreed. "Ryder is a good man, Mama. I am so happy." "I can see that. I am glad, sweetheart. You deserve every bit of happiness." The baby came in August during the hottest part of the summer. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Grace was sure she would not survive it. But Ryder stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead, and telling her she was the strongest, bravest woman he had ever known. Her mother acted as midwife, calm and competent, guiding Grace through each contraction. When the baby finally came, red-faced and screaming, Grace heard her mother say, "It is a boy. You have a son." Ryder took the baby from Mary with shaking hands, staring down at the tiny, perfect face with an expression of absolute awe. "A son. We have a son, Grace." Grace held out her arms, and Ryder carefully placed the baby against her chest. She looked down at her son, at his dark hair and his red, wrinkled face, and felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. This was her child, hers and Ryder's, proof that something good and beautiful could come from pain and shame. "What should we name him?" she asked. Ryder touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, his face soft in a way Grace had never seen before. "How about John, after my stepfather? John Henry Hayes." "John," Grace repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, John. Welcome to the world." Mary stayed for 2 weeks, helping Grace recover and teaching her how to care for the baby. When she finally returned to Sioux Falls, she hugged Grace and Ryder both. "You have made a good life here. I am proud of you, Grace. And Ryder, thank you for taking such good care of my daughter." "It is not a hardship, madam," Ryder said honestly. "She takes care of me just as much." The years that followed were full and rich. John grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. 2 years after John, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, and 2 years after that, another son they named William. The house was constantly full of noise and chaos and love. Ryder expanded the ranch gradually, buying more land as they could afford it, building up the herd. Sam retired eventually, and they hired younger hands to replace him, but he stayed in a small cabin on the property, too attached to the Hayes family to leave entirely. Martinez married a widow from town and brought her to live in the new foreman's house Ryder built. Grace became known in the area as a woman of strength and kindness. She helped other women in the community, particularly those who found themselves in difficult situations. More than once, a pregnant girl with no prospects showed up at the Hayes ranch, and Grace would take her in, help her find work or a husband, or just give her a safe place to stay until she could figure things out. Ryder never questioned it, just made room and treated Grace's strays with the same respect he showed everyone. The scandal of Grace's past faded over the years, replaced by respect for the woman she had become. Even people in Sioux Falls eventually admitted that Ryder Hayes had chosen well, that his wife was an asset to the community. Mrs. Henderson apologized to Grace 10 years after the wedding, admitting she had been wrong to judge so harshly. Grace accepted the apology with grace, but never quite forgot the cruelty. Thomas Whitmore tried to speak to her one more time, years later when she was in town buying supplies with little Sarah on her hip. He approached her on the street, older now and softer around the middle, his golden good looks fading into ordinariness. "Grace, I mean Mrs. Hayes, I just wanted to say that I am glad you are doing well. You seem happy." Grace looked at him, this man who had once caused her such pain, and felt nothing but mild pity. "I am happy, Thomas, happier than I ever could have been with you. I made a mistake," he said quietly, "letting you go. I realized that too late." "Yes, you did. But it worked out well for me in the end. I hope you find happiness too, Thomas. I really do. But please do not approach me again. My husband does not like it, and frankly, neither do I." She walked away without looking back, Sarah babbling happily in her arms. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder took Grace to the place where he had first seen her, the steps of the church in Sioux Falls. It was a Sunday morning, and people were gathering for services, the same people who had once shunned her. "What are we doing here?" Grace asked, confused. "I wanted to remind you," Ryder said. 10 years ago, I walked into that store and asked you to marry me because I thought it was the right thing to do. Best impulsive decision I ever made." He took her hands in his. "I love you more now than I did then, which I would not have thought possible. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, children, a reason to get up every morning. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Grace felt tears pricking her eyes. "I love you too. You saved me, Ryder, not just from the town's judgment, but from losing myself entirely. You gave me back my life and then filled it with more joy than I knew existed." He kissed her there on the church steps, in front of God and the good people of Sioux Falls, and Grace kissed him back without shame or hesitation. She was Grace Hayes, wife and mother and survivor. She was loved and respected and happy. She was no longer ruined. She had never really been ruined at all. She had just been waiting for the right man to see her worth. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Their children grew tall and strong, each with their own personality and dreams. John took to ranching like he had been born to it, riding almost before he could walk, spending every spare moment with his father learning the business. Sarah was fierce and independent, more likely to be found fixing fence or gentling horses than doing needlework. William was quiet and thoughtful, always with his nose in a book, and Grace saw in him the scholar she might have been if circumstances had been different. In the summer of 1888, when Grace was 34 and Ryder 42, they stood on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. John was 16 now, tall and capable, helping Martinez with the evening feeding. Sarah, at 14, was in the barn tending to a mare about to foal. William, 12, was inside reading by lamplight. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked, leaning against Ryder's solid warmth. "Marrying a ruined woman in front of the whole town," Ryder laughed, deep and genuine. "Every single day." Grace elbowed him, and he caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I regret that I did not do it sooner," he said seriously. "I regret every day you spent suffering before I found the courage to act. I regret that I cannot go back and punch Thomas Whitmore in his smug face." He turned to look at her, his eyes warm with love and something deeper than simple affection. "But I do not regret a single moment of our life together. Not one." Grace reached up and touched his face, this man who had become her whole world. "The town called me ruined, but you saw something worth saving. The town was full of fools. I just saw you." They stood together in the fading light, comfortable in the silence of long companionship. Inside the house, William called that dinner was probably burning. From the barn, Sarah shouted that the mare was in labor. John came running from the corrals, excited and ready to help. Their life was loud and messy and filled with the constant demands of family and ranch. It was nothing like the fairy tale Grace had once imagined for herself, back when she was young and naive enough to believe in Prince Charming. It was so much better. Ryder squeezed her hand, and together they went to deal with whatever crisis came next, the way they always did. Side by side, partners in every sense of the word, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something that would last. By the time Grace was 40, the Hayes Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the region. They had expanded to over 5,000 acres and ran nearly 1,000 head of cattle. John was 22 and essentially running the day-to-day operations alongside his father. Sarah, at 20, had shocked everyone by becoming one of the best horse trainers in South Dakota, with buyers coming from as far as Montana to purchase her gentled stock. William, 18, was preparing to attend college back east, the first in either family to do so. Grace had also given birth to 2 more children in the intervening years, both surprises but welcome ones. Daniel was 8 now, a wild child who kept them all on their toes. And little Emma, just 5, was the baby of the family and utterly spoiled by her older siblings. The ranch house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. It now had 6 bedrooms, a proper dining room, and a parlor where Grace kept her growing collection of books. Ryder had prospered, but more than that, he had built a legacy. On a crisp October morning in 1894, Grace stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast for what felt like an army. John's wife Beth was there, pregnant with their first child and Grace's first grandchild. Sarah was visiting between horse sales, sitting at the table sketching plans for a new training facility. William was home from college for a brief break, full of stories about his classes and professors. Daniel and Emma were supposedly washing up, but were more likely playing in the creek behind the house. Ryder came in from his morning check of the stock and wrapped his arms around Grace's waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Smells good." "Same as every morning," Grace said, but she leaned back into his embrace. Even after 18 years of marriage, his touch still sent warmth through her. "Best breakfast I have ever had, then." "You say that every day." "Because it is true every day." Beth laughed from her seat at the table. "You two are still like newlyweds. It is adorable." "Embarrassing, more like," Sarah said, but she was grinning. William looked up from the newspaper he was reading. "There is an article in here about a suffragist rally in Sioux Falls. Says women are demanding the right to vote." "Good," Grace said firmly. "They should have it." Ryder made a non-committal sound and Grace elbowed him. "Do not even start. You know I am right." "I know that arguing with you is pointless once you have made up your mind," Ryder corrected. "Which is why I have survived 18 years of marriage." The family gathered around the expanded table, all talking over each other, arguing about politics and horses, and whether Daniel should be punished for putting a frog in Emma's bed. Grace looked around at all of them, her heart so full it ached. This was her life. These people were hers, built from nothing but determination and love and the grace of a man who had seen past her supposed ruin to the woman beneath. After breakfast, when the children had scattered to their various activities and Ryder had gone out to work, Grace walked to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, and Grace had brought her here to be buried on Hayes land. Her father had followed 6 months later, and they lay side by side under simple markers. Grace stood looking at their graves, thinking about forgiveness and understanding. Her father had never quite managed to look at her with pride, but he had softened toward the end, admitting that Ryder Hayes was a good man, and that Grace had done well for herself. It was not everything she might have wanted, but it was something. "I wish you could have seen us truly happy," she said to her mother's grave. "I wish you could have known that I made it through, that I built something good." The wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of autumn and coming winter. Grace closed her eyes and let herself remember that girl of 22 who had walked into Miller's store expecting nothing but more humiliation, who had been given instead the chance at a new life. She had taken that chance with both hands and built a future she could not have imagined in her darkest moments. She had loved and been loved. She had raised children who were good people, who knew how to work hard and treat others with respect. She had stood beside a man who had never once made her feel less than she was, who had defended her honor and cherished her heart. The town had called her ruined. Ryder Hayes had said she would be Mrs. Hayes by noon, and in doing so, he had given her back more than just respectability. He had given her life itself. Grace walked back to the house, where Ryder was waiting on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered her one with a smile that still made her heart skip, even after all these years. "What were you thinking about up there?" he asked as she settled beside him. "About how lucky I am, about how different things could have been." "No luck about it. You fought for this life, Grace. You earned it." "We earned it," she corrected. "Together." "Together," he agreed and touched his cup to hers in a quiet toast. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and grandchildren to be move about the ranch, building their own futures. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, promising a beautiful day. Grace leaned her head on Ryder's shoulder and smiled, perfectly content. She had been called ruined, but she had been remade instead. Remade into someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth, someone who could look back on her life and see nothing but blessings. "I love you," she said quietly. "I love you too," Ryder replied. "Have since that first day, I think." "I just did not realize it yet. Liar. You married me because you needed a cook. I married you because you were the bravest person I had ever seen. The cooking was just a bonus." Grace laughed, and the sound carried across the prairie, bright and free and full of joy. She was 55 years old and had lived through enough hardship for 3 lifetimes. But she had also loved and been loved, and in the end, that was what mattered. The Hayes ranch thrived. The Hayes family grew. And Grace and Ryder grew old together, still holding hands, still making each other laugh. Still grateful for that impulsive moment 18 years ago when a rough cowboy had walked into a store and declared a ruined woman would be his wife by noon. It had been madness, marrying a stranger to escape scandal. It had also been the best decision either of them ever made. Years continued to pass with the inevitable march of time. By the turn of the century in 1900, the Hayes family had become something of a dynasty in the region. John and Beth had 4 children now, running their own section of the ranch with the same dedication Ryder had shown. Sarah had married a fellow horse trainer and moved to Montana, though she visited often with her 2 daughters. William had become a lawyer and returned to South Dakota to practice, buying a house in Sioux Falls but spending every weekend at the ranch. Daniel, at 14, was already showing signs of being even more skilled with cattle than his father. And Emma, 11, was everyone's darling, bright and sweet and completely fearless. Grace and Ryder were in their late 40s and mid-50s now, both showing the wear of hard lives well lived. Ryder's dark hair was streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. Grace's waist had thickened after 6 pregnancies, and her hands showed the effects of decades of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had taken a leap of faith together on a hot July day in 1876. One evening in early spring, after a dinner that had included 3 generations of Hayes family members, Grace and Ryder took their customary walk around the property. It was something they had done for years, a chance to talk privately and simply enjoy each other's company. "John wants to buy the Miller place," Ryder said as they walked. "It adjoins our eastern boundary, would give us another 2,000 acres and access to that good water. Can we afford it? Probably. Would be tight for a while, but John is right that it is a good investment." Ryder glanced at her. "What do you think?" Grace considered. "I think John has good judgment. If he thinks it is worth doing, we should trust him. He has grown into a fine man, hasn't he? They all have. We did well, Ryder. You did well. I just tried not to mess up too badly." Grace laughed and took his arm. "You did considerably more than that, and you know it." They walked in silence for a while, comfortable and content. Then Ryder said, "I got a letter today, from Thomas Whitmore." Grace stopped walking. "What? He is dying. Cancer, apparently." "He wanted to write and apologize properly, before it is too late." Ryder pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to Grace. She unfolded it with trembling fingers and read by the fading light. Thomas's handwriting was shaky but legible. He wrote that he had lived with regret for decades, that he had never found happiness because he had known it was undeserved. He apologized for his cowardice, for the pain he had caused, for letting his family ruin her reputation to protect his. He said he had followed her life from a distance and was glad she had found happiness despite his actions. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, just wanted her to know that he was sorry. Grace read it twice, then carefully folded it and handed it back to Ryder. "He is sorry. Does it matter?" She thought about it. "Yes. Not because it changes anything, but because it confirms what I already knew. He was weak and we are strong. He wasted his life with regret and we built something beautiful from the wreckage." She looked up at her husband. "I forgive him, Ryder. Not for his sake, but for mine. I do not want to carry that anger anymore." Ryder pulled her into his arms and they stood together in the twilight, two people who had weathered every storm and come through stronger for it. "I love you," he said into her hair. "Have I mentioned that recently?" "Not in the last hour or so." "Then I am clearly slacking. I love you, Grace Hayes, more than life itself." Grace closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of him, leather and sage and home. "I love you too. Thank you for walking into that store 24 years ago. Thank you for being brave enough to see past what everyone else saw. Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a rough cowboy who barely knew which end was up." They walked back to the house hand in hand, past the barn where Daniel was doing evening chores, past the corral where Emma was saying good night to her favorite horse. Inside, they could hear the sound of their grandchildren laughing, the voices of their adult children discussing ranch business and politics and all the small details of life. This was legacy, Grace thought. Not just land or cattle or money, but family. Connection. Love that grew and expanded and created something bigger than any individual. That night, lying in bed with Ryder's arms around her, Grace thought about all the paths her life might have taken. She could have given in to despair when Thomas left. She could have refused Ryder's proposal and spent her life as a cautionary tale. She could have let bitterness consume her, turning her hard and cold. Instead, she had chosen hope. She had chosen to take a stranger's hand and walk into an unknown future, and that choice had made all the difference. "What are you thinking about?" Ryder murmured, half asleep. "About choices, about how one moment can change everything. Like the moment I saw you on those church steps, like the moment I said yes to a man I did not know." Ryder's arms tightened around her. "Best yes I ever got." Grace smiled in the darkness. Outside, the prairie wind sang its eternal song, the same wind that had blown on that hot July day 24 years ago when a ruined woman had been offered redemption and a lonely cowboy had found his home. The town had called her ruined. Ryder Hayes had called her wife. And in the space between those two declarations, Grace Dalton Hayes had found herself and built a life beyond her wildest dreams. By 1910, Ryder and Grace were firmly entrenched in the roles of patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family empire. The ranch now encompassed over 12,000 acres, employing dozens of hands and supporting not just their immediate family, but an entire community of people who depended on the Hayes operation for their livelihoods. Grace was 66 now, her dark hair completely white, her face lined with the evidence of decades spent smiling and squinting into prairie sun. But her eyes were still bright, still sharp, and her mind had only grown more formidable with age. She had become something of a legend in the region, the ruined woman who had risen to become one of the most respected matrons in South Dakota. She sat on charity boards, helped establish a school in the area, and continued her quiet work helping women in difficult situations. Ryder was 74, moving slower than he once had, but still vital and active. He had officially turned the ranch over to John 5 years earlier, but could not quite give up his daily rides to check on things. His love for Grace had only deepened with time, becoming less passionate perhaps, but more profound, rooted in decades of shared experience and unwavering partnership. Their children were all established in their own lives now. John's oldest son was 22 and being groomed to eventually take over the ranch. Sarah's daughters were accomplished horsewomen in their own right. William had been elected to the state legislature, making Grace proud beyond words. Daniel had married and was running a satellite ranch operation 50 miles south. And Emma, 21 and unmarried, was scandalizing society by attending college and talking about becoming a doctor. On a golden October afternoon in 1910, the entire Hayes family gathered for a party celebrating Ryder and Grace's 34th wedding anniversary. The ranch yard was filled with tables groaning under the weight of food, children running everywhere, adults talking and laughing. It seemed like half the county had turned out to honor the couple who had become institutions in the region. Grace stood on the porch watching it all, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of her life. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren ran past, squealing with delight. Her children stood in clusters, successful and confident, passing on the values she and Ryder had instilled in them. Ryder came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, just as he had done for 34 years. "Quite a party, quite a life," Grace corrected. "No complaints." "Not a single one. Not even about the stubborn cowboy you married." Grace turned in his arms and looked up at him, this man who had given her everything. "Especially not about him. He was the best thing that ever happened to me." Ryder smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something beautiful. "The feeling is mutual, Mrs. Hayes." They kissed there on the porch in front of God and their enormous family and everyone who had once judged them, and the crowd broke into applause and cheers. Their grandchildren made exaggerated gagging noises, but they were grinning. As the party continued into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than any group could possibly eat, Grace found a quiet moment to speak to each of her children privately. She told John how proud she was of the man and rancher he had become. She told Sarah that her spirit and independence had always been a joy. She told William that his compassion and intelligence would take him far. She told Daniel that his dedication to family made her heart full. And she told Emma to never let anyone tell her what she could not do, to reach for her dreams no matter how impossible they seemed. "Like you did, Mama," Emma said, hugging her fiercely. "You taught me that." Late that night, after everyone had gone home or settled into guest rooms and bunkhouses, Grace and Ryder sat alone on the porch under a sky brilliant with stars. They were too old to sit comfortably on hard wood, so they had brought out proper chairs, but they still held hands across the space between them. "You remember that first night?" Grace asked. "How terrified we both were. I remember thinking I had made the craziest decision of my life. And now I know I made the craziest decision of my life. Just turned out to be the right kind of crazy." Grace laughed softly. "I was so afraid you would regret it, that you would wake up one morning and realize you had saddled yourself with a broken woman. You were never broken, Grace. Hurt, yes. Damaged by circumstances and cruel people, but not broken. Your strength was there all along. I just gave you a safe place to rediscover it." "We saved each other," Grace said. You saved me from a life of shame and isolation. I saved you from loneliness and an empty house. Fair trade. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere an owl hooted. The cattle were settling for the night with occasional lows and rustling. The wind whispered through the grass, eternal and unchanging. "When I am gone," Ryder said suddenly, "and I will go first, we both know that. When I am gone, I want you to remember something." "Ryder, do not talk like that. Hush, let an old man get sentimental." He squeezed her hand. "I want you to remember that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Every day with you was a gift, and if there is anything after this life, I will be waiting for you. So do not hurry, but do not forget I am waiting either." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "You are not allowed to leave me. We made vows. Till death do us part. I'm holding you to that. Death might have something to say about my side of that bargain eventually, but Grace, dying will just be the first time we will be apart. It will not be the end. Nothing can end what we have. Promise me you will fight to stay. Promise me you will not give up." "I promise I will stay as long as I possibly can. But when it is my time, you have to let me go. And then you have to keep living, keep being the amazing woman you are, for our children and grandchildren, for yourself." "I do not want to think about this." "Neither do I. So let's not tonight. Tonight let's just sit here and count stars and be grateful for every moment we have had." And that is what they did. Two old people who had once been young and desperate, who had taken a chance on each other and built something that would outlast them both. Ryder Hayes died in the winter of 1913, at the age of 77. He went peacefully in his sleep, Grace curled beside him as she had been for 37 years. When she woke and realized he was gone, she did not scream or wail. She simply held him close and whispered, "Thank you for everything. I will see you again when my time comes." The funeral was enormous, attended by hundreds of people whose lives Ryder had touched. But the most moving moment came when Grace stood at his grave and spoke not of his accomplishments but of his character. "My husband was not a fancy man. He did not have much education or refinement. But he had integrity. He had courage. He had the ability to see past what others saw to what was truly there. 37 years ago, he offered me a chance at a new life when I had given up hope. He kept that promise every day we were together. He made me feel valued and loved and cherished. He was my partner, my best friend, my greatest love. And I am grateful for every moment we had, even though it was not nearly enough." She lived another 7 years, dying at 76 in 1920. In those 7 years, she saw Emma graduate from medical school, the first female doctor in their region. She saw William help secure voting rights for women in South Dakota. She saw John's grandson take his first steps. She saw Sarah's horse training operation become nationally recognized. She also quietly ensured that the ranch would stay in family hands, that the legacy she and Ryder had built would continue for generations. She established a foundation to help women in desperate situations, endowing it with enough money to continue the work she had started decades earlier. When death came for her, she was ready. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her bed, holding her hands, telling her they loved her. With her last breath, she smiled and said, "I see him." He waited. They buried her next to Ryder on the hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that read, "Grace Dalton Hayes, 1854–1920. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was never ruined, only refined by fire." The Hayes Ranch continues to this day, still owned and operated by their descendants, still thriving, still a testament to what two people can build when they take a chance on each other. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, ranch hands swear they see two figures walking hand in hand through the prairie grass. an old cowboy and the woman he called his wife, still together, still in love, still proving that the best love stories are the ones that seem impossible at the start. The town called her ruined. The cowboy said she would be Mrs. Hayes by noon, and in the space between those two truths, they built something eternal. A love that transcended scandal and circumstance, that grew from desperation into something beautiful and strong and unbreakable. They proved that redemption is real, that second chances matter, that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil. Their story lived on in the memories of their descendants, in the stories told around dinner tables, in the way their family treated each other with respect and compassion. It lived on in the foundation Grace established, in the women whose lives were changed because she never forgot where she came from. It lived on in the very land itself, in the grass and the cattle and the house that still stood strong after more than a century. Some love stories are written in the stars, fated and predestined. But Ryder and Grace's love story was written in dust and determination, built from nothing but courage and a willingness to see each other clearly. It was a love story that said people could change, could grow, could become more than their worst moments. It was a love story that said ruined was just a word, and words could be rewritten. It was a love story that said home was not a place but a person, and family was what you built through love and commitment, and showing up every single day. Most of all, it was a love story that said sometimes the bravest thing you can do is take a stranger's hand and walk into an uncertain future, trusting that together you can build something better than either of you could alone. The whole town called her ruined. The cowboy said she would be Mrs. Hayes by noon. And by saying yes, by choosing hope over despair, by taking one scared step forward into the unknown, Grace Dalton became Grace Hayes and found not just redemption but joy, not just respectability but love, not just survival but a life so full and rich it took her breath away until her very last moment. That is the story, that is the legacy, that is what remains when the dust settles and the years pass and the people fade into memory. Love remains, family remains. The choices we make when faced with impossible odds, those remain too, echoing through generations, proving that the human spirit is resilient and beautiful and capable of extraordinary things. Ryder and Grace Hayes built more than a ranch. They built a testament to the power of kindness, second chances, and the revolutionary act of seeing people as they truly are rather than as others label them. And that testament stands still, strong and proud, on the South Dakota prairie where it all began on a hot July day in 1876.